Okay, yesterday. When I left off, Stanley had found Zero, and Zero's not in good shape. He's been out there in the hot sun with no water for a long time now. And they start eating sploosh out of these jars that Zero found, and they eat the last jar of sploosh. And Stanley says it kind of tastes like peaches, which is interesting because remember Catherine Barlow, Kissin' Kate Barlow, used to can spiced peaches and everybody loved them. Interesting. And then they start walking. Stanley's trying to convince Zero to go back to camp, but he's like, I'm not going back. So then they start walking toward Big Thumb, and Zero keeps on falling over because he's not feeling good. His stomach is like super cramping, and he's just not in good shape. So they're hoping that they can make it to Big Thumb and that they'll be able to find some water or something to help them. And that's about where we're at. Here we go. Stanley wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for them. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for Zero, but cared about Zero. They simply just destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend that he was never there. He wondered what she would tell them, and when. What do you think's up there? Zero asked. Stanley looked to the top of Big Thumb. Oh, probably an Italian restaurant, he said. Zero managed to laugh. I think I'm going to get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer, said Stanley. I want an ice cream sundae, said Zero, with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge. The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up toward it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shore, where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they had been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb up out of it. They could no longer see Big Thumb because the cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked out the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. I'm all right, he whispered. Stanley saw a rut, about a foot wide and 6 inches deep, running down the cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. Let's try there, he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb, straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him, somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide ledge, and Zero came up alongside him. You okay? Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs up sign, and Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. Give me a boost, said Zero, and then I'll pull you up with the shovel. You won't be able to pull me up, said Stanley. Yes, I will, said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped on his interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help him from below as Zero pulled himself up onto the ledge. While Zero was getting himself situated up there, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap, and he held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed hold of the sack and then the shovel. He set the shovel so that half of the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung down towards Stanley. Okay, he said. Stanley doubted that this would work. It was one thing for him to lift Zero, who was half of his weight, but it was quite another for Zero to try to pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed up the rock wall, using the sides of the rut to help support him. His hands moved one over the other, up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hand clasp his wrist. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength and for a brief second seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall and with Zero's help pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist, and it took him a moment to realize that it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both of his hands. He had held on to the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked up his blood. One of the glass jars had broken in the sack, and they decided to save the pieces. They might need to make a knife or something. They rested briefly and then continued on up. It was fairly easy to climb the rest of the way. When they reached flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball balancing on top of Big Thumb. Soon, they were walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. Chapter 37. "We're almost there," said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now that they really were almost there, it scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If there was no water, no refuge, then they'd have nothing, not even hope. There was no exact place where the flatland stopped and the mountain began. The ground just got steeper and steeper, and then there was no doubt that they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb because the mountain, or the slope of the mountain, was in the way. It became too steep to go straight up, so instead they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed directions. Patches of weeds dotted the mountainside. They walked from one patch to another, using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, and they had to be careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid that they'd never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. Besides, he knew they didn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began appearing above the weed patches. A swarm of gnats hovered around them, attracted by their sweat. Neither Stanley nor Zero had the strength to try to swat at them. "How are you doing?" Stanley asked. Zero pointed thumbs up, and then he said, "If a gnat lands on me, it will knock me over." Stanley gave him some more words. "B-U-G-S, he spelled. Zero concentrated hard and then said, "Boogs." Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's thick, sick and weary face as he said, "Bugs." "Good," said Stanley. "Remember, it's a short U sound if there's no E at the end. Okay, here's a hard one. How about L-U-N-C-H? Un. Zero suddenly made a horrible, wrenching noise as he doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body shook violently, and he threw up, emptying his stomach of the sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths, and then he straightened up and continued going. The swarm of gnats stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boys' faces. Stanley didn't give him any more words, thinking that he needed to save his strength. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, Zero said, "Lunch." As they climbed higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker, and they had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in the thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. "Weeds and bugs," he said. "There's got to be water around here somewhere. We must be getting close." A wide clown-like smile spread across Zero's face, and he flashed the thumbs up sign, and then fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. "Come on, Zero," he urged. "We're getting close. Come on, Hector. Weeds and bugs. Weeds and boogs." Stanley shook him. "I've already ordered your hot fudge sundae," he said. "They're making it right now." Zero said nothing. Oh no, what do we think is going to happen? Zero's not in good shape. I'm really hoping that he's going to be okay. We'll read more tomorrow.